The city of Riverside was waking up slowly. The sun rose lazily over the horizon, painting the sky a pale pink. Bob Thompson, as he had every weekday morning for the past 15 years, awoke 20 minutes before the alarm clock rang. His internal clock worked with the precision of the mechanism of the cars he repaired in his shop. In his 50s, Bob retained a strong physique, the result of physical labor rather than self-care. Broad shoulders, wiry arms, and machine grease permanently embedded in his skin were his trademark. The graying of his once brown hair had already taken its toll, and the corners of his eyes were wrinkled from his habit of squinting at the sun. But his main characteristic was his thoroughness in his movements, his decisions, his habits. He turned his head and looked at his sleeping wife. Linda lay with her back to him, covered almost head to toe with the blanket, as she always did. Even in the summer, she was freezing, and Bob had gotten used to this peculiarity of hers, as he had to many others in 20 years of marriage. Bob got up quietly, trying not to wake his wife, and made his way to the bathroom. His morning shaving ritual took him exactly 7 minutes. He methodically ran the razor over his cheeks, neck, and chin. He usually used this time to reflect on the day ahead. An old Ford with transmission problems was due in the shop today. Difficult work, but that was the kind of task he liked, requiring patience and attention to detail. Opening the cabinet behind the mirror to pull out aftershave, Bob noticed a small orange pill jar hidden behind his razors. He frowned. The jar was unlabeled, and he didn't remember seeing it before. Bob opened the lid and looked at the small white pills. He didn't take any medication except the occasional headache pill, and these were clearly not aspirin. They must have been Linda's, but why was she keeping them in his part of the locker? A floorboard creaked downstairs. Linda had woken up and gone down to the kitchen. Bob put the jar back in its place and closed the locker. He went downstairs where his wife was already preparing breakfast, scrambled eggs and bacon for him and avocado toast for herself. That too was part of their morning ritual. Linda Thompson was a thin woman with neat facial features and blonde hair that she tinted to hide the gray. At 52, she still maintained her figure and moved with a kind of elusive caution, as if constantly afraid of breaking or hurting something. 20 years as a cashier at Save Mart had taken its toll on her, the habit of speaking quietly but clearly, and smiling even when she didn't want to. "Good morning," she said without turning around, somehow knowing he'd entered the kitchen. "The coffee's almost ready." "Morning," Bob replied, taking a seat at the table. They had never been the kind of couple who talked much in the morning. As Linda prepared breakfast, Bob watched her furtively. He had noticed a change in her lately. Nothing specific, just the general impression that she was even quieter, even more withdrawn. Occasionally, he caught her gaze staring off into the distance, as if she were mentally in a completely different place. "The Wilsons' lawn hasn't been mowed again," Bob said, breaking the silence. Talking about the neighbors was safe territory. Linda set a plate of scrambled eggs in front of him. "Steve's on the road again. He won't be back until tomorrow." Steve Wilson had lived across the street for the past 7 years. He was a trucker, often gone for days at a time. He and Bob clashed periodically over lot boundaries and the noise the Wilson family made on weekends. Steve had 3 teenage children, and quiet was never a strong point in their home. "You could have at least asked the kids to keep it clean," Bob grumbled, though he really didn't care what his neighbor's lawn looked like. Linda just shrugged and sat down across from him with a cup of coffee and some toast. Bob noticed that she hardly touched her food, just nibbled small pieces off the toast and sipped her coffee. "Are you all right?" he finally asked. "Yeah, sure," she answered too quickly. "Just not very hungry. Nancy brought over a pie yesterday, and I had a piece before bed." Nancy Johnson, Linda's co-worker at the supermarket, was her only close friend, a short, full woman with a perpetual smile and a habit of prying. She often dropped by with some baked goods and the latest gossip. Bob didn't particularly like her too chatty, but Linda seemed to value the friendship. "Gossiping late into the night again?" Bob asked, trying to keep his voice lighthearted. "No, she just dropped by for a little while." Linda stood up and began washing her cup, turning her back to him. "I have to get ready for work. My shift starts at 9. Bob nodded, even though he knew her schedule perfectly well. For 10 years, Linda had worked the same shift, 9 a.m. to 6 p.m., 5 days a week, as predictable as he was. Bob's auto shop was located in an industrial part of Riverside, a 20-minute drive from their home. A small brick building with 3 elevators and an office littered with papers and parts catalogs. Bob was the sole owner but employed 2 mechanics, a young guy named Jake, fresh out of technical college, and Ray, a grumpy old man who'd worked with Bob since the shop opened 15 years ago. The Ford with the problematic transmission was indeed proving to be a difficult case. Bob spent most of the day under the car, completely immersed in the work. This was another character trait of his, the ability to disconnect from the world and focus only on the mechanism in front of him. At such moments, he felt at peace. The world of automobiles was logical, predictable. If something went wrong, there was always a reason that could be found and fixed. It wasn't until lunchtime, when Ray brought them sandwiches from the cafe across the street, that Bob remembered the strange jar of pills again. He never pry into Linda's business. It was part of their unspoken agreement. She didn't ask him about work, except for general questions, and he didn't interfere with her life outside their home. But something about this situation bothered him. "Hey, boss, are you sleeping with your eyes open?" Ray's voice snapped him out of his reverie. "Eh? No, just thinking about the transmission," Bob lied, taking a big bite out of his sandwich. Ray chuckled. At 67, he was a veritable encyclopedia of automotive problems and human foibles. "Yeah, the transmission. I used to call my wife that too when we were still married." Bob smiled weakly. Ray's divorce story was legendary in their small collective. His wife had left him for the dentist, taking half the property and the dog. Ray had lived alone ever since, and never missed an opportunity to joke about marriage. 20 years together and still no divorce, Ray continued, looking at Bob with a mixture of respect and bewilderment. "What's the secret, boss?" Bob shrugged. "No secret at all. Just living our lives." But even as he said the words, he sensed their falsity. Shouldn't there be something more after so many years together? Some special closeness or understanding? Had he and Linda ever had that? He remembered their first meeting at the same supermarket where she still worked. She was the new cashier, and he had come in to buy a beer after work. Her quiet voice and the way she carefully put the groceries in the bag caught his attention for some reason. He started coming into that store more often, always choosing her checkout line. Then he asked her out on a date. She agreed not immediately, only after the 3rd attempt. Their relationship developed slowly, without much passion. 2 years later, they were married in the city hall, without a lavish ceremony, with only 2 witnesses. There was no honeymoon, no loud party, just 2 people who decided to join their lives together for their own reasons. They had no children. At first, they put the matter off. They wanted to get on their feet, buy a house. Then Linda went to the doctors several times, but they never told him what the problem was. At some point, the subject of children just stopped coming up in their conversations, becoming another unspoken taboo. "Hey boss, there's a call for you." Ray interrupted his thoughts again, nodding at the office phone. Bob wiped his hands and walked over to the machine. Bob's auto shop speaking. "Mr. Thompson?" The woman's voice sounded uncertain. "This is Nancy Johnson, a friend of Linda's. She wanted me to tell you she's going to be late today. She needs help with inventory, and she'll be home around 8 o'clock. Bob frowned. Linda never asked anyone to call him. She usually sent the message herself or called if plans changed. Why hadn't she called herself? A second pause. Oh, her phone was dead and she'd forgotten the charger at home. You know how it is? Something in Nancy's voice sounded fake, but Bob didn't insist. "Okay, thanks for the call." Hanging up the phone, he stood motionless for a while. Strange call, strange pills. The pieces weren't adding up. Or maybe he was just looking for problems where there weren't any. 20 years is a long time. Maybe he's just bored, and his brain is clinging to little things, blowing them up to the size of a mystery. In the evening, Bob decided to stop by the supermarket where Linda worked. He rarely did that. Their worlds hardly ever crossed outside the house. But tonight, something nudged him. Save Mart was an ordinary suburban supermarket, brightly colored signs, discounts on seasonal items, the smell of freshly baked goods from the bakery at the back of the place. Bob walked past the vegetable rows to the cash register, looking out for his wife. Linda was not in her usual spot. Instead, a young girl with bright pink hair was sitting at checkout number 5, chewing gum. "Excuse me, where is Linda Thompson today?" Bob asked, walking up to the register. The girl shrugged her shoulders. "I don't know. I was just asked to fill in for her. Maybe she's in the back or taking the day off." Bob nodded and headed for the service entrance. He wasn't authorized to be there, but the guard at the entrance knew him by sight and just nodded, letting him inside. The back room was quiet and cool. Rows of boxes of merchandise, a forklift in the corner, a few computers for inventory. Bob walked further into the staff break room. The door was ajar and he heard voices. One belonged to Nancy and the other was his wife's voice. "I can't take it anymore," Linda said. Her voice sounded torn, almost desperate. "He's beginning to suspect something." "Hush, honey." Nancy's tone was soothing. "It's been so many years, no one knows anything. The pills... I forgot to put them away today. What if he found them? What if he started asking questions? Linda, listen to me. Even if he did see something, what would he know? You don't keep documents at home, do you?" Bob froze, hesitant to go in or call his wife. What documents were they talking about? And why was Linda so afraid he'd find those pills? "There's a box in the attic," Linda said quietly after a pause. "Old things I brought back from before I met Bob. There might be photographs, papers. God, Linda, why would you keep this stuff at home? I couldn't just, throw it all away. It's my life, you know? It's who I was." Bob stepped back carefully, trying not to make any noise. His heart was pounding like crazy. Who was she? What was the secret his wife had been keeping all these years? He quickly left the supermarket, forgetting to even say goodbye to the security guard. He got into his car and just sat there for a while, trying to collect his thoughts. Then he started the engine and drove home. There he went straight up to the attic. They rarely came up here, mostly to get Christmas decorations once a year, or to hide some unnecessary but miserably thrown away things. The attic was dusty and cramped, with a sloping ceiling and a small window on the west side. He found the boxes of Linda's things almost immediately, 3 cardboard boxes stacked neatly in the far corner. There was no writing on them. Bob opened the first box. Old clothes, some books, school notebooks, nothing special. The second contained albums of photos of very young Linda with parents Bob had never seen. They had died before they met. School group shots, prom. Bob had never taken much interest in his wife's past, and now these photos seemed like windows into the life of a stranger. In the third box, he found what he was looking for. Beneath a layer of old magazines lay a file folder and an envelope of photographs. Bob opened the envelope first. The photos were old, some faded around the edges. On them was a young man, in his early 20s, with surprisingly familiar facial features. There was something of Linda about him, the same eyes, a similar cheekbone line. A brother? But Linda had never mentioned a brother. Turning over one of the photos, Bob saw the caption, "Larry, graduation, 1989. Larry. That name didn't tell him anything. He set the photos aside and opened the file folder. Inside was an old passport in the name of Lawrence Smith, some medical certificates, and Bob froze, looking at the birth certificate. Lawrence Edward Smith, born in the year 1971 in the city of Cleveland, Ohio. Parents, Edward and Mary Smith. These were Linda's parents. He remembered their names from conversations. The cool evening wind blew in through the attic window, ruffling the pages of papers in his hands. Bob sat motionless, trying to comprehend the information that was unfolding before him, changing everything he knew about his life. Who was Linda Thompson really, and what else had she been hiding from him all these years? Bob spent a sleepless night. He lay on his side of the bed, looking up at the ceiling and listening to Linda's measured breathing. The woman he had lived with for 20 years. A woman he turned out not to have known at all. In the morning, he got up earlier than usual. He made coffee, sat down at the kitchen table, and waited. His mind was full of questions, but none of them he dared to ask directly. How do you ask a man you've lived with for 2 decades who he really is? Linda came downstairs at 7:30 as usual. She looked tired, like she hadn't slept either. Their gazes met for a moment, and Bob saw a strange expression in her eyes, a mixture of fear and determination. "You're up early," she said, heading for the coffee maker. "I couldn't sleep." Linda poured herself some coffee and sat down across from him. Her hands were trembling slightly, and she gripped the cup tightly, as if trying to hide it. "Are you feeling sick?" Bob asked, watching her pale face and tense posture. "It's just a little migraine," she said, not looking at him. "It's a day off, so why don't we go out? It's been a long time since we've been out of town." It was so unlike Linda to suggest spontaneous trips. She usually preferred quiet weekends at home, reading books, watching TV, sometimes working in the garden. Bob realized she was trying to avoid something, perhaps a conversation she was dreading. "I can't," he lied. "I promised Ray I'd help with his nephew's car. Complicated case, needs 4 hands." Linda nodded with barely perceptible relief. "I see. I guess I'll go over to Nancy's then. She's been asking to watch some new TV show for a while." They ate breakfast in silence, each absorbed in his own thoughts. Bob wondered how many times over the years they had sat across from each other like this, keeping their secrets. Was their life just a well-performed play? An hour later, Linda drove away in her old Honda Civic. Bob watched the departing car from the living room window. Instead of turning right, toward Nancy's house, Linda drove in the opposite direction. This only reinforced his suspicions. He dressed quickly, grabbed the keys to his pickup truck, and followed her at a safe distance. He'd never had to follow someone before, and he felt ridiculous, like a character from a cheap detective show. But the need to know the truth overpowered all other feelings. Linda drove across town and stopped outside a small private clinic on the outskirts. The building was unremarkable one-story, with a small sign that read Dr. Parker's Clinic. Bob parked across the street, behind a large tree, and waited. Linda stayed at the clinic for about an hour. When she came out, she had a small paper bag in her hand, probably containing medication. She got in her car and drove away, but not to her home or Nancy's. Instead, she headed into the suburbs, toward a small cafe that Bob had never seen before. He parked at a distance again and watched his wife meet a stranger, a tall man in his 60s with a gray beard. They hugged like old friends and sat at a table by the window. Bob felt anger building up inside. All these years, had she been faithful to him? Or was this just one of her many secrets? But something about their interaction didn't seem romantic. They talked seriously, sometimes Linda wiping away tears. The man held her hand like a father comforting his daughter. Bob decided he'd had enough of watching. He started the engine and drove not home, but in the direction of Nancy Johnson's house. It was time for direct questions. Nancy lived in a small one-story house on a quiet street on the east side of town. Bright pink flamingos adorned her lawn, and pots of flowers stood on the porch, a typical home of a single woman in her 50s. She opened the door after the 3rd ring and froze on the threshold when she saw Bob. Her usually ruddy face paled. "Bob, is something wrong?" There was genuine concern in her voice. "We need to talk, Nancy, about Linda." She hesitated a moment, then stepped back, allowing him to enter. Nancy's living room was as bright and cluttered as she was a floral-patterned sofa, lots of cushions, walls hung with photographs and paintings. "Sit down," she said, pointing to the sofa. "Would you like some tea?" "No, I want the truth. Who is Lawrence Smith?" Nancy froze halfway to the chair. Her eyes widened and she pressed her hand to her breast. "Did she tell you?" Nancy asked quietly. "No, I found the papers. The photographs." Nancy took a deep breath and sank into a chair. She looked suddenly aged. "It's not for me to tell the story, Bob. Linda should do that. She lied to me for 20 years. I have a right to know." "Yes, you do," Nancy admitted after a pause. "But I won't be the one to tell her secret. All I can say is that Linda loves you. She always has. Everything she's done out of fear of losing you." "What kind of pills is she taking?" Bob asked, changing tactics. Nancy tensed even more. "Linda has medical problems. It's hormone therapy. I won't say anything more than that." "Talk to her, Bob. She deserves a chance to explain herself." Bob realized he couldn't get anything more out of Nancy. He stood up, heading for the exit. "When did you find out?" he asked, stopping in the doorway. "From the beginning. We met in cheerleading," Nancy answered quietly. "Please, Bob, be good to her." "It wasn't easy for her." He said nothing and walked out, leaving Nancy sitting in the chair with an expression of deep concern on her face. On the way home, Bob stopped by the library. He had never been particularly tech-savvy and preferred to look up information the old-fashioned way. The young librarian helped him find medical reference books and showed him how to use the computer to search the internet. He spent the next 3 hours reading about hormone therapy, transsexuality, and sex reassignment surgeries. Each new piece of information was like a blow. He felt like a complete idiot who hadn't noticed the obvious for 20 years. Or maybe not wanting to notice. So many things made sense now. The lack of children, Linda's reluctance to go to the doctors with him, her secrecy about her past, the peculiarities of her body that he had written off as individual differences. How could he have been so blind? Or maybe subconsciously he had always suspected something but preferred not to shatter the comfortable illusion of their marriage. By the time Bob got home, it was already dark. Linda's car was parked in the driveway. She was home, probably wondering where he'd been missing all day. For the first time in 20 years of marriage, he hadn't given her any notice of his plans or returned her calls. Bob sat in the car looking out the glowing windows of their house. Inside was the woman he thought he knew best in the world. But did he really know her? And what to do with that knowledge now? Anger struggled within him with confusion. He felt betrayed, deceived. But at the same time, he remembered their years together quiet, measured, happy in their own way. Were those years real, or had he been living with a ghost, an illusion? Finally, pulling himself together, he got out of the car and headed for the front door. Linda was waiting for him in the living room. She was sitting on the couch, hands folded in her lap, back unnaturally straight. In front of her on the coffee table were the very documents and photographs he had found in the attic. She knew he'd seen them. "You haven't been to Ray's," she said quietly. "I called the workshop." "And you weren't at Nancy's," he replied, stopping in the middle of the room. "I saw you at the clinic, and at the cafe with some man." Linda nodded, accepting his words. "That's Dr. Greenberg. He helped me years ago. We meet sometimes when I need support." "Support for what, Linda? Or should I call you Larry?" She flinched as if struck by a blow. Her eyes filled with tears, but she held them back. "I haven't been Larry for 30 years, she said quietly but firmly. "I'm Linda. I've always been her, even when I was stuck in the wrong body." Bob shook his head. 20 years, Linda. 20 years of marriage, and you never once thought that maybe I should know that my wife was born a man? "I was afraid," she admitted, finally letting the tears flow. "Afraid you'd leave, that you'd hate me. At the beginning of our relationship, I almost decided to tell you, but you once said you didn't understand those perverts, and I just couldn't." Bob remembered that conversation. They were watching the news, and there was a report about some transgender person. He'd actually said something like that thoughtlessly, without thinking about the implications of his words. "Have you been on the pill all these years?" he asked, pointing to an orange jar that was also on the table. "Yes, hormone therapy. It changes my body and helps me be the person I've always felt I was. And this Dr. Greenberg he helped you with the transition, yeah. He's a psychiatrist specializing in gender dysphoria. He helped me find surgeons, endocrinologists, supported me when my family turned their backs." Bob sank into the chair across from her. He felt devastated. "Why now, Linda? Why after 20 years are you suddenly worried that I'll find out?" Linda wiped away her tears and looked him straight in the eye. "Because Steve Wilson recognized me. He comes from the same town as me. We went to the same high school. He was a couple years older, but he remembered Larry Smith. He started asking questions, hinting, I was afraid he was going to tell you. That's it. Steve, with his nasty looks and odd remarks over the last few months. And you're determined to keep it from me?" Bob's voice was growing irritated. 20 years of lies. 20 years of living with a man who didn't trust him enough to reveal the most basic truth about himself. "I didn't know how to tell you," Linda replied. It was getting harder every year. "How do I explain why I kept quiet for so long?" Bob stood up and walked over to the fireplace. On the shelf was a picture from their wedding, a simple ceremony at City Hall. Just them and a couple of witnesses. He looked at the smiling face of the woman he had married and couldn't recognize her. Or him, who was the man he had lived with for 20 years. "I can't accept it," he said quietly. I can't just forget that our whole life together you lied to me. I never lied about my feelings for you." Linda rose from the couch and took a step toward him. "I loved you every day of those 20 years. It was never a lie." Bob turned to her and their gazes met. There was pleading in her eyes, hope for understanding. But inside him, a hurricane of emotions raged: anger, betrayal, disgust, and somewhere deep inside, pity. Pity for the woman who was so afraid of losing him that she chose to live a lie. "Who do you think you are?" he asked. "Deep down, Linda, or Larry? Who are you really?" "I've always been a woman, Bob," she replied, even when my body said otherwise. "I'm Linda, your wife, the same woman you've had breakfast with every morning for 20 years, the same woman who loves cherry pie and old movies, the same woman who loves you." She took another step toward him and held out her hand, but Bob pulled back. He couldn't touch her now. To him. He didn't know how to think about this man. "Yeah, I need time," he said, heading for the door. "I can't stay here right now." Linda's hand dropped down helplessly. "I understand," she said, and her voice sounded dead. "Where are you going to go?" "I don't know. To Ray's, maybe, or to a motel." He opened the door, but stopped on the threshold. Something kept him from just leaving. Maybe the habit of 20 years together, or something deeper. "Were you ever going to tell me?" he asked without turning around. "Every day I thought about it," Linda answered quietly. "Every day I was afraid you'd find out. And every day I hoped that if you found out, you'd understand." Bob nodded, not knowing what else to say. Words seemed powerless in the face of what had opened up between them. "I'll call you," he finally said, and walked out, closing the door behind him. He got into the car, started the engine, but didn't move. His mind was reeling with fragments of memories: their first meeting, their first date, their wedding, the quiet evenings at home, their plans for the future together. All these moments were now colored in different tones, took on a new meaning. He looked back at the house. Linda's silhouette could be seen in the living room window, standing looking at him as she often did when he left for work. A familiar gesture, a familiar image. But now it was different. His gaze fell to the glove compartment of the car. His spare gun lay there, an old Colt .45 caliber he kept in the car for self-defense. Riverside was a quiet town, but Bob always preferred to be ready for trouble. The thought came suddenly, like a flash. 20 years of a life based on lies. 20 years of this man pretending to be someone he wasn't. 20 years of Bob being a toy in someone else's hands, not knowing the true nature of his marriage. He opened the glove compartment and looked at the gun. The cold metal gleamed in the light of the street lamp. At that moment, Linda stepped out onto the porch. She stood in the doorway, backlit by the light from the house, a frail figure in a simple house dress. "Bob?" she called out. "Please, let's talk some more. Don't go away like this." He looked at her, and images flashed before his eyes: the young Larry Smith from the photograph, Linda on their wedding day, Linda making breakfast this morning. Bob got out of the car, clutching a gun in his hand. Linda noticed the weapon and froze. "Bob," she said quietly, "please don't do this." 20 years, he said, walking up the porch steps. 20 years of my life you stole from me with your lies. "No, Bob," her voice was pleading. "Those were real years, real feelings." "Real?" He almost laughed. "What was real about them, Larry? Don't call me that." Tears glistened in her eyes. "I'm Linda. I've always been Linda on the inside." "You're a liar," Bob said, raising his gun. "You stole my life. I thought I was marrying a woman and I got—" He couldn't finish the sentence. The anger that had been building up inside him all day burst out, drowning out all other feelings. Linda looked at him with an expression of deep sadness. "I've always been afraid of this," she said quietly. "I always knew you couldn't accept the truth. I'm sorry, Bob, for everything." She closed her eyes as if preparing to accept her fate. In the stillness of the night, a deafening gunshot rang out. It was followed by absolute silence, broken only by the sound of raindrops beginning to fall from the sky, as if nature was mourning what had happened in that quiet suburban home. On the porch of the Thompson house lay a motionless body. Blood slowly spread across the wooden boards. Linda was dead. Detective John Miller arrived on the scene at 22 hours and 15 minutes. The rain had intensified, turning the ground around the Thompson house into a muddy mess. Police cars with blinkers, yellow tape cordoned off. Curious neighbors gathered in the distance, a common sight for a small-town murder. Linda Thompson's body had already been covered with a tarp, but the dark blood stain on the front porch was blurred by the rain, creating a grim picture. A young officer, Jenkins, met Miller at the front door. "Detective, the victim is Linda Thompson, 52 years old, gunshot wound to the chest. Body was discovered by a neighbor, Steve Wilson. He heard a gunshot and called the police. By the time we got there, the place was empty." "The husband?" Miller asked, looking around the crime scene. "Robert Thompson, 55, owner of an auto repair shop. His whereabouts are unknown at this time. His car is missing, he's not answering his cell phone." Miller nodded. The disappearance of a husband right after his wife's murder always looked suspicious. But in his 25 years with the Riverside Police Department, he'd learned not to jump to conclusions. "What about the gun?" "Not found, sir. But initial assessment is that it's a large caliber handgun, possibly a .45. See if Thompson has a registered gun, and canvass the neighborhood. I need to know if the couples had any recent conflicts." Miller went into the house. The living room was in perfect order, nothing to indicate a fight or an argument. On the coffee table were scattered papers and photographs. The detective put on gloves and studied them carefully. An old passport in the name of Lawrence Smith, medical certificates for hormone therapy, sex reassignment surgery papers. Everything indicated that Linda Thompson had previously been a man. In one of the photos was a young man whose features suggested the future Linda. An orange jar of estrogen pills lay nearby. Miller wondered, could the discovery of this secret be a motive for murder? By morning, the police had established a few key facts. Robert Thompson had a registered Colt .45 caliber handgun that he kept in the glove compartment of his car. That gun disappeared with the owner. According to neighbors, a loud conversation was heard at the Thompson home yesterday afternoon. Bob was then seen leaving in a distraught state of mind and did not return until evening, shortly before the shooting. Miller was sitting in his office studying the information he had received when there was a knock on the door. Officer Maria Gonzalez, a recent transfer to their precinct, entered. "Sir, we've got two leads. First, Steve Wilson, the neighbor who called the police, went to the same high school as Linda Thompson when she was still Larry Smith. There are old school records of a conflict between the two. Interesting." Miller made a note in his notebook. "And the second lead? Linda's friend, Nancy Johnson. They worked at the supermarket together. According to other neighbors, Bob Thompson came by yesterday and had a serious talk with Nancy and left very upset." "All right," the detective nodded. "Let's start with Wilson. Something tells me old high school grudges could be a serious motive. Steve Wilson lived across the street from the Thompsons. A tall man with a hard look and the rough hands of a trucker met the detectives on the doorstep. "I already told you everything yesterday," he said grudgingly. "I heard a gunshot, looked out the window, saw Linda on the porch and called the police right away." "Did you see anyone near the house?" Miller asked. Wilson looked away as if hiding something. "No. Interesting." Miller looked across the street at the Thompson house. Wilson tensed. "I wasn't watching their house. I just happened to hear a gunshot." "Did you know Linda Thompson used to be a man?" Wilson's eyes narrowed. "Yeah, we went to school together. Larry Smith." He said the name with undisguised distaste. "I didn't immediately recognize her when I moved here. But gradually, I noticed the resemblance." "And what was your relationship like at school?" "He was a bastard," Wilson said bluntly. "He and his friends bullied anyone who wasn't like them, especially people like me." "Like you?" Wilson was silent, but his gaze hardened. "I was from a poor family. Different. They found evidence and spread it around the school. My father almost killed me when he found out. Sent me to military school to make a man out of me." "So you had a motive to hate Linda Thompson," Miller remarked. "Linda's not Larry," Wilson countered. "I didn't kill her, if that's what you're implying. Check where her husband was last night." Miller made a note in his notebook. There was definitely something Wilson wasn't telling him. Nancy Johnson looked grief-stricken. A full-figured woman in her 50s with bright red hair and weeping eyes met the detectives in her small house on the outskirts of town. "I still can't believe it," she said, wiping away tears. "Linda was my best friend. Did you know about her past?" Miller asked. Nancy nodded. "Yes, we met at a support group for transgender people. I too." She paused. "I've been through it too. Not as fully as Linda, but we understood each other. Bob Thompson came to your house yesterday. What did you two talk about?" "He found Linda's papers." Nancy sighed. "He was furious. He asked me if I knew the truth. I couldn't lie. I told him Linda was always afraid he'd find out and hate her. Tried to explain that she was the same woman he'd loved for 20 years. Miller hesitated, making another note in his notebook. The picture was becoming clearer, but the key question remained. Who exactly pulled the trigger? "How did he react?" Miller clarified. "Terribly. He said his whole life was a lie, that he'd lived with a monster. I was afraid he might do something terrible, but I didn't think it would come to this," Nancy sobbed. "Did you try to warn Linda?" "Yes," I called her. She was strangely calm, said she'd been waiting for this day for a long time, that maybe it was time for the truth, even if it meant the end of their marriage. Miller listened intently, making notes. The story was starting to come together, but there were still too many questions. "Where were you last night at the time of the murder?" Nancy tensed. "At home, watching TV." "Can anyone confirm that?" "No, I live alone." Miller nodded. Another suspect with no alibi. On the third day of the investigation, a new lead emerged. A gun was found in a dumpster 5 blocks from the Thompson house. Ballistics confirmed it was the gun that fired the fatal shot. No fingerprints were found. The weapon had been thoroughly wiped down before being thrown away. And 2 days later, police arrested Bob Thompson at a bus station in a neighboring town. He didn't resist. He looked tired, broken, like he'd been through a meat grinder. In the interrogation room, Miller watched him carefully. Bob had changed over the days. He looked gaunt, with shadows under his eyes and gray in his hair. "Why did you run away, Mr. Thompson?" the detective asked. "I didn't know what to do," Bob answered quietly. "After what happened, I just drove without thinking where I was going. Tell me what happened that night." Bob was silent for a long time, looking at his hands. "I found out that my wife, that Linda used to be a man, found documents, pictures, 20 years of marriage, and all that time she'd lied to me. I was furious. I talked to her friend Nancy and she confirmed it. Then Linda and I had a fight. I left, got in my car. I tried to drive away, but I couldn't. There was a gun in the glove compartment." "And you came back with a gun?" Miller asked. "Yes." Bob looked up, his eyes full of pain. "I didn't mean to shoot. I wanted to scare her, maybe. I don't know. But when I saw her on the porch, something inside broke. I fired without thinking, and then I couldn't believe I did it." "Is that why you wiped off the prints and threw the gun away?" "Yeah. I thought maybe it would go away. But then I realized I wasn't going anywhere." Miller sighed and closed his notebook. "Bob Thompson, you're under arrest for the murder of Linda Thompson." The case was going to trial a month later. Miller met again with Steve Wilson and Nancy Johnson. Both were being held as witnesses for the prosecution. But something still bothered the detective. "You knew about Linda's past," he told Wilson, "and you threatened to expose her secret. Why?" "I didn't threaten," Steve countered. "I just reminded her sometimes that I knew. She deserved a little fear after what she did to me." "Did you talk to Bob Thompson about it?" "No," Wilson answered firmly. "I didn't want to ruin their marriage. I just wanted her to remember the past." Miller shifted his gaze to Nancy. "And you? You could have lied to Bob, said you didn't know anything. But you confirmed the truth. He already knew," she answered quietly. "He found the documents. I tried to explain, hoping he'd understand. But he was so angry. I didn't think he was capable of murder." "And yet," Miller observed, "you were both part of this tragedy. One held her past over her as a threat. The other failed to protect her friend." Both remained silent. In that silence, Miller saw a confession. At the trial, Bob Thompson pleaded guilty. In his last statement, he said, "I killed the man I loved for 20 years. At first, I thought I killed her for lying. Now I realize I killed her because of my inability to accept the truth she was the same woman I'd always been. If I'd had another chance, I would have told her that her past didn't matter compared to our life. The court considered the circumstances, lack of premeditation, and sincere remorse. Bob was sentenced to 10 years in prison with the possibility of parole in 5 years. After the hearing, Miller stopped Steve Wilson. "You saw everything that night, didn't you? Not just the body, but the moment of the gunshot." Wilson sighed heavily. "Yeah, I saw Bob come back. How they stood on the porch, saw the gun in his hand. Linda hadn't even tried to run away. It was like she was expecting it. Why didn't you just say so?" "I don't know." Wilson lowered his eyes. "Maybe part of me thought that Larry deserved it, for what he did in high school, for the way he broke my life. But then I realized it was wrong. No one deserves an end like this." Miller nodded. "You're a victim too, Mr. Wilson. But don't let the pain of the past control your future. That's a lesson Bob learned too late." Nancy approached the detective too. "I had to do something," she whispered. "When Bob came to me like that, I should have warned Linda, or you, but I hoped he'd cool down. No one could have predicted how far things would go," Miller replied. Later, when all the formalities were completed, the detective stood outside the courthouse looking out at the rain, just like the night before, when the truth could no longer be hidden. He thought about how many tragedies in the world happen because of the fear of being misunderstood and rejected. Linda was afraid her husband would find out the truth and reject her. Bob couldn't handle the truth being revealed. Nancy and Steve witnessed, but each in their own way failed to prevent the tragedy. In this small town where everyone knows each other, secrets have proven deadly. They ruined lives, broke hearts, and led to an avoidable tragedy. If only people would tell the truth to those they love, and found the strength to accept the truth about those they thought they knew.